Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
The courtroom falls silent as my own parents sit across from me, their lawyer smugly presenting documents demanding control of everything I own. My apartment, my car, my bank accounts. They want it all because I'm supposedly too irresponsible to handle my grandfather's inheritance. Mom won't even look at me. Dad's jaw is set in that familiar, stubborn line. Their attorney, Harold Kellerman, adjusts his expensive tie with the confidence of someone who's never lost a case. But they have no idea what's coming. 3 months ago, my life changed forever with a single phone call. I was restocking shelves at the electronics store where I'd been working for 2 years when my phone buzzed. The voice on the other end belonged to a lawyer I'd never heard of telling me my grandfather William had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral arrangements had already been made by my parents, he explained, but there was something else. Something that would reshape everything I thought I knew about my future. Grandpa William had left me an inheritance. Not just a few $1,000s or some family heirlooms, but $300,000 in carefully invested accounts, plus his cabin in Vermont that overlooked Lake Champlain. I nearly dropped the phone right there between the television displays and sound systems. My parents, Robert and Linda, seemed genuinely happy for me when I called them with the news. Dad actually choked up talking about how proud Grandpa would be that I was finally getting a real chance in life. Mom immediately started planning how we could honor his memory at the funeral service. For those first few weeks, it felt like we were a family united in grief and gratitude. But then the comments started. "You know, Sean, you shouldn't rush into anything major with this money," Dad said over coffee after the funeral. "Your grandfather worked his whole life to save this. You want to make sure you honor that." Mom nodded earnestly. "Maybe we should all sit down with our financial advisor, Gerald. He's been helping us for 15 years. He could give you some guidance." At first, I appreciated their concern. After all, I was 28 years old with a spotty track record. I dropped out of art school at 22 when I couldn't handle the pressure and debt. Since then, I'd bounced between retail jobs, never quite finding my direction. Maybe they were right to worry about me making smart choices. But their suggestions became increasingly persistent. Every conversation somehow circled back to the inheritance and what I should or shouldn't do with it. When I mentioned wanting to finally move out of the cramped apartment I shared with 2 roommates, Dad's face darkened. Throwing money away on rent when you could be investing for your future, that doesn't sound very responsible, son. "Your father's right," Mom chimed in. "You should be thinking long-term, building wealth, not spending it on temporary things." The pressure intensified when they arranged a meeting with Gerald, their financial advisor, without asking me first. I showed up at their house for what I thought was a regular family dinner, to find Gerald spread out at the dining room table with charts and investment portfolios. "Sean," Gerald said, rising to shake my hand with the overly firm grip of a man trying to establish dominance, "your parents have told me so much about your situation. I think we can really help you make some smart moves here." For the next 2 hours, Gerald and my parents tag-teamed me with advice about conservative investments, the dangers of liquid cash, and the importance of professional guidance for someone in my position. Every time I tried to express my own thoughts or ask questions, they'd exchange meaningful glances and redirect the conversation. Despite their pressure, I went ahead with my plan to move into a modest 1-bedroom apartment downtown. It wasn't fancy, just $700 a month in a converted warehouse building, but it was mine. Using part of the inheritance for the security deposit, and first few months' rent felt like the first truly adult decision I'd ever made. My parents' reaction was swift and harsh. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," Mom said when I told her about signing the lease. "You're already making impulsive decisions without thinking them through." "We're just trying to protect you from yourself," Dad added. "You don't have experience managing this kind of money." What hurt most was discovering they'd been talking to other family members about my poor choices. At my cousin Sarah's birthday party, Uncle Carl pulled me aside with a concerned expression. "Your parents are really worried about you, Sean. They said you're already burning through your grandfather's money pretty fast." I felt my stomach drop. "I haven't burned through anything. I just moved into my own place." Carl's expression softened with pity. "Look, I know it's exciting having money for the first time, but maybe you should listen to your folks. They've got more experience with financial planning." This conversation happened 3 more times at that party with different relatives. My parents had been conducting a whisper campaign painting me as irresponsible and reckless with my inheritance. The worst part was, none of it was true. I'd been incredibly careful with the money, spending only what was necessary and keeping the rest in the same conservative investment accounts Grandpa had set up. But the real breaking point came 2 weeks later, when I stopped by their house to pick up some old books from my childhood bedroom. Mom was in the kitchen making her famous beef stew, and Dad was watching the evening news. Everything seemed normal until I went to grab a napkin from the drawer by the sink. Underneath a stack of grocery store coupons, I found legal documents with the letterhead of Kellerman Phillips and Associates. The header read "Petition for Limited Conservatorship," and my name was typed in neat legal font under "Proposed Conservatee." My hands started shaking as I scanned the pages. The documents outlined a legal strategy for my parents to gain control over my financial decisions, claiming I lacked the capacity to manage my inheritance responsibly. There were bullet points about my history of academic failure and pattern of impulsive behavior. Most shocking of all, the documents were dated 3 weeks before my parents had ever expressed any concerns to me about the inheritance. This wasn't a reaction to my apartment rental. This was a premeditated plan they developed the moment they learned about Grandpa's will. I carefully placed the papers back under the coupons and walked into the living room where my parents were discussing what to watch on television. They looked so normal, so loving, debating between a cooking show and a detective series. But now, I knew the truth. While they'd been hugging me and expressing pride in my inheritance, they'd already been plotting to take it away. I should head home. I said, my voice somehow steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Already, Mom looked genuinely disappointed. "I was hoping you'd stay for dinner." "Yeah, I've got some things to take care of." Dad muted the television and turned to face me. "Everything okay, son? You look a little pale." I studied his face, searching for any sign of guilt or deception. But all I saw was the same concerned expression he'd worn throughout my childhood, whenever I was upset or worried. Either he was a better actor than I'd ever imagined, or he genuinely convinced himself that plotting to control my inheritance was an act of love. "Everything's fine," I lied. "Just tired from work." As I drove back to my apartment, my mind raced through every interaction we'd had since the inheritance. Every suggestion about financial advisors, every comment about my poor judgment, every conversation with relatives. It had all been building toward this legal ambush. But what hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the realization that my parents had never actually believed in me. Despite working steadily for 6 years since leaving art school, despite never asking them for money or getting into any real trouble, they saw me as fundamentally incapable of handling responsibility. In their minds, I was still the confused 22-year-old who dropped out of college, not a man approaching 30 who'd learned to take care of himself. That night, I sat in my new apartment surrounded by the boxes I was still unpacking and tried to figure out what to do next. The legal documents suggested they were serious about pursuing conservatorship, which meant they had lawyers and a plan. I had moral outrage and $300,000 I might not be allowed to spend on my own defense. For the first time since Grandpa died, I wondered if inheriting his life savings had been a blessing or a curse. 2 weeks after finding those legal documents, my parents called with an invitation that should have been a red flag. "So, Sean, honey, why don't you come over for dinner, Sunday night?" Mom's voice had that artificially cheerful tone she used when she was nervous. Your father and I want to talk about your future. We think it's time we all sat down and had a serious conversation about your plans. I almost said no. Every instinct told me this was connected to the conservatorship papers I'd found. But part of me hoped I was wrong. Maybe they'd reconsidered. Maybe we could work this out as a family without lawyers and legal threats. I arrived at their house Sunday evening carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the button-down shirt Mom had given me for Christmas. The familiar smell of her pot roast filled the hallway, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Dad hugged me at the door and asked about work. Mom fussed over whether I was eating enough. We could have been any family gathering for dinner on a quiet Sunday night. But when I walked into the living room, I found two strangers sitting on the couch. Harold Kellerman looked exactly like what central casting would order for a predatory attorney. Silver-haired, expensive suit, manicured fingernails, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The woman beside him was younger, maybe 45, with auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun and a clipboard balanced on her knees. "Sean," Dad said, his voice suddenly formal, "I'd like you to meet Harold Kellerman, our attorney, and Dr. Patricia Morse, a psychological evaluator." My stomach dropped. This wasn't a family dinner. This was an intervention. "What's going on here?" I asked, still holding the bottle of wine like a shield. Harold stood and extended his hand. "Mr. Sean, your parents asked me to come tonight because they're deeply concerned about some decisions you've been making. They love you very much, and they want to make sure you're protected." Dr. Morse smiled with practiced warmth. "Why don't you sit down, Sean? We're all here because we care about your well-being." I remained standing, protected from what? Mom's eyes were already red with tears. "Honey, we know this feels sudden, but we've been watching you since you got the inheritance, and we're worried you're not thinking clearly about the future. Your apartment rental was just the beginning," Dad added. "We've seen the bank statements, large cash withdrawals, expensive purchases. You're going through that money faster than you realize." This was completely false. Other than the apartment deposit and some basic furniture, I'd been incredibly conservative with my spending. But before I could defend myself, Harold was pulling manila folders from his briefcase. "Your parents have documented several concerning incidents," he said, laying out papers on the coffee table. "Unpaid bills, erratic behavior, questionable financial decisions. They're not trying to hurt you, Sean. They're trying to help you before you make mistakes you can't undo." Dr. Morse leaned forward with her clipboard. "Sean, I specialize in helping families navigate difficult financial transitions. Sometimes when people receive sudden wealth, it can trigger impulsive behaviors or poor judgment. It's more common than you might think. Can you tell me about your decision-making process for major purchases?" She continued. "Do you research beforehand, or do you tend to act on immediate impulses?" I felt like I was being cross-examined in my own family's living room. "Are you seriously psychoanalyzing me right now?" "We're just trying to understand your current state of mind," Dr. Morse said, making notes on her clipboard. "Your parents mentioned you've been isolated lately. Fewer family visits, less communication. Have you been experiencing any mood changes or unusual thoughts since receiving the inheritance?" "Unusual thoughts like what?" Harold consulted his notes. "Your parents are concerned about some phone conversations you've had recently. Mentions of moving fast with investments, blowing through money, jokes about being rich. They're worried someone might be influencing you or that you're developing unrealistic expectations about your financial situation." My blood ran cold. They'd been recording my phone calls. The conversation Harold was referencing had been with my college friend Marcus, where I joked about feeling weird having money for the first time. It had been a light-hearted conversation about finally being able to afford name-brand groceries, not some confession of financial recklessness. "You've been spying on me." Dad looked genuinely pained. "We weren't spying, son. We were trying to understand what was happening with you. You've been different since the inheritance. Secretive. Making major decisions without talking to us first. I'm 28 years old. I don't need permission to rent an apartment. But you do need guidance, Mom said, tears flowing freely now. Honey, you dropped out of school. You've never had a career or managed anything bigger than a monthly paycheck. This inheritance is more money than most people see in their lifetime. We can't just watch you throw it away. Harold spread out more documents. Sean, we're proposing a limited conservatorship arrangement. Your parents would help oversee major financial decisions while you maintain independence in your daily life. Think of it as training wheels until you develop more experience with wealth management. And if I say no, the room fell silent. Harold and Dr. Morse exchanged a meaningful glance. My parents stared at their hands. Finally, Harold spoke. If you're unwilling to accept voluntary oversight, your parents would have no choice but to petition the court for involuntary conservatorship. They have documentation of concerning behaviors and financial decisions that suggest you may lack the capacity to manage your inheritance safely. Documentation of what behaviors? Dr. Morse consulted her clipboard again. Large cash withdrawals without clear purpose, rental agreements signed without family consultation, social isolation, jokes about spending money recklessly, a history of academic failure, and inability to maintain long-term commitments. Every item on her list was either completely normal adult behavior or a distorted interpretation of harmless conversations. But presented in clinical language, my life sounded like a case study in poor judgment and mental instability. This is insane, I said. You're pathologizing normal life choices. Sean, Dad said, his voice heavy with disappointment. We're not your enemies here. We're your family. We've watched you struggle for years to find direction. Now you have this incredible opportunity, and we're terrified you're going to waste it. Harold pulled out a final document. We need an answer tonight, Sean. Either you agree to voluntary conservatorship with your parents as co-trustees, or we file a petition with the court tomorrow morning. Either way, we're going to make sure your grandfather's legacy is protected. I looked around the room at these four people who claimed to love me, while simultaneously orchestrating the systematic destruction of my independence. My parents' faces were etched with what looked like genuine concern, but I now knew they'd been planning this for weeks. Harold and Dr. Morse watched me with the detached interest of professionals billing by the hour. I need time to think about this. Unfortunately, time is a luxury we don't have, Harold said. Your parents have already invested considerable resources in this process. Dr. Morse has cleared her schedule for a full evaluation. Court dates have been tentatively reserved. We need a decision tonight. The ultimatum was clear. Submit to their control or face a public legal battle where my private life would be dissected by strangers and my fitness to manage my own affairs would be debated in open court. I stood up, still holding the unopened bottle of wine. I'm not signing anything tonight. Mom started sobbing. Honey, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We're trying to help you. By threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent, Dad's face hardened. If that's what it takes to protect your grandfather's legacy and your future, then yes, we'll do whatever is necessary. I walked toward the door, my legs feeling unsteady. Then I guess I'll see you in court. Harold's voice followed me down the hallway. Sean, you should know that conservatorship cases are public record. This will affect your credit, your ability to get loans, your professional reputation. Are you really willing to risk all of that instead of accepting help from people who love you? I paused with my hand on the doorknob. People who love me don't spy on my phone calls and threaten to have me declared incompetent. Outside in my car, I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes trying to process what had just happened. Through the living room window, I could see the four of them huddled around the coffee table, probably planning their next move. My parents had just chosen money over trust control, over respect, fear over faith in their own son. But what scared me most was the realization that they might actually succeed. I had no legal experience, limited resources compared to their coordinated effort, and a paper trail of normal young adult behavior that could be twisted into evidence of instability. In 3 months, I'd gone from feeling grateful for an unexpected inheritance to facing the possibility of being legally declared incompetent to manage my own life. As I drove back to my apartment, I made a mental note to start documenting everything. If my parents wanted a legal battle, I'd give them one. But I had no idea how much worse things were about to get. Finding a lawyer willing to take my case proved harder than I'd expected. Most of the established firms in town either had conflicts of interest or quoted fees that would consume a significant portion of my inheritance. The attorneys who specialized in family law seemed uncomfortable with conservatorship defense, while the ones experienced in conservatorship cases typically represented the petitioners, not the targets. After a week of frustrating phone calls, I finally found Jessica Branch, a 29-year-old attorney who'd graduated from law school just 3 years earlier. Her office was in a converted house downtown, and her receptionist was actually her law school roommate working part-time between teaching jobs. But Jessica had passion, intelligence, and most importantly, she believed my parents' petition was ethically questionable. Conservatorship is supposed to be a last resort for people who genuinely can't manage their affairs, she explained during our first meeting. From what you've told me, you're a functional adult who happens to disagree with your parents about financial planning. That's not grounds for legal incapacity. Jessica's confidence gave me hope, but that hope was quickly tested when we arrived at the courthouse for the first hearing. Harold Kellerman had brought what looked like a small army of legal support. Besides himself, there was a junior attorney, a paralegal, and a court reporter they'd hired privately to supplement the official record. My parents sat in the front row behind Harold's table, dressed like they were attending a funeral. Dad wore his best navy suit, the one he saved for important business meetings. Mom had on the black dress she'd worn to Grandpa's memorial service. They looked somber and responsible, like concerned citizens performing an unpleasant but necessary civic duty. Judge William Harrison was exactly what central casting would order for an old-school family court judge: silver beard, wire-rimmed glasses, and the weary expression of someone who'd seen every possible variety of human dysfunction parade through his courtroom. He looked like he'd rather be fishing than mediating family disputes about money. Harold's opening statement was a masterpiece of character assassination disguised as loving concern. Your Honor, this case involves a young man who has received a substantial inheritance but lacks the experience and judgment necessary to manage it responsibly. The petitioners Robert and Linda Morrison are not seeking control of their son's life. They're seeking to protect an inheritance that represents their deceased father's life work and ensure it's managed in a way that honors his memory and secures their son's future. Harold presented a carefully curated narrative of my life that turned every normal struggle into evidence of incapacity. My decision to leave art school became a pattern of abandoning commitments when faced with challenges. My years working retail were described as inability to maintain stable professional advancement. My apartment rental was impulsive decision-making without consideration of long-term consequences. The most devastating testimony came from Mrs. Coleman, my parents' neighbor for the past 15 years. She was a sweet woman in her 70s who'd always been kind to me, which made her words that much more painful. "I've known Sean since he was a teenager," she said in her soft grandmother voice. "He's always been a good boy, but since he got this inheritance, I've noticed some concerning changes. Loud music at all hours, strange visitors coming and going. Last week I saw him loading expensive electronics into his car at midnight." Every word was technically true, but completely misleading. The loud music was me watching movies in my new apartment with decent speakers for the first time in years. The strange visitors were friends helping me move furniture. The expensive electronics being loaded at midnight were Christmas gifts I'd bought for my family, which I was taking to my car to keep them secret. But presented in Mrs. Coleman's concerned tone, these innocent activities sounded like evidence of drug dealing or mental breakdown. Dr. Morse's testimony was even more damaging. She'd never spent more than 30 minutes with me, but she presented a detailed psychological profile that painted me as emotionally unstable and prone to poor judgment. In my evaluation, Sean displayed several concerning patterns, she told the court. Difficulty accepting guidance from authority figures, defensive responses to reasonable questions about his decision-making, signs of grandiosity related to his financial situation. When I asked about his long-term planning, his responses were vague and unrealistic. Jessica tried to object to this testimony on the grounds that Dr. Morse hadn't conducted a proper psychological evaluation, but Judge Harrison overruled her. The court is interested in professional observations about the respondent's capacity for financial decision-making. When it came time for the financial evidence, Harold presented bank statements and receipts that told a story of reckless spending. The apartment deposit was labeled as unnecessary housing expenses. Furniture purchases were described as luxury acquisitions. Even my grocery bills were scrutinized as evidence that I was living beyond my previous means. Marcus Webb, a financial consultant Harold had brought in as an expert witness, explained to the court why my spending patterns were concerning for someone with limited experience managing substantial assets. Young people who receive sudden wealth often experience what we call windfall syndrome, Webb testified. They make emotional rather than rational financial decisions, prioritizing immediate gratification over long-term security. The respondent's expenditures suggest this pattern is already emerging. My own testimony felt like an uphill battle from the moment I was sworn in. Harold's cross-examination was designed to make every answer sound defensive or irresponsible. Mr. Morrison, when you decided to rent an apartment, did you consult with any financial advisors? I didn't think I needed to consult anyone about spending $700 a month on housing. So you made a decision involving thousands of dollars annually without seeking professional guidance. It's a normal apartment rental, not a major investment. But for someone with limited experience managing substantial assets, wouldn't professional guidance be prudent for any major financial commitment? Every question was a trap designed to make me sound either arrogant or naive. If I defended my decisions, I appeared resistant to guidance. If I admitted uncertainty, I seemed incapable of responsible judgment. Judge Harrison's questions were particularly troubling because they revealed his assumptions about young people and money. Mr. Morrison, help me understand your long-term financial planning. Where do you see yourself in 10 years? I'd like to go back to school, maybe pursue a career in graphic design or art therapy. The inheritance gives me the freedom to explore options I couldn't afford before. And have you researched the costs of these educational programs? The job market in these fields? The likelihood of earning enough to justify the investment? I've done some preliminary research, but I wanted to take time to explore my options carefully. Judge Harrison made notes while I spoke, but his expression suggested my answer confirmed his concerns about my planning abilities. The hearing concluded with Harold requesting immediate temporary conservatorship, while the case was pending, arguing that every day of delay put my inheritance at greater risk. Jessica objected, but Judge Harrison granted a modified version of the request, freezing my access to investment accounts while allowing me to maintain my checking account for daily expenses. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My parents hadn't spoken to me directly, but as they passed by with Harold's entourage, Dad caught my eye and mouthed, "I'm sorry," with what looked like genuine regret. But sorry wasn't enough to undo the damage they'd already set in motion. That evening, the local news ran a story about the case under the headline, "Family Fights to Protect Inheritance from Reckless Son." The reporter had clearly gotten most of her information from Harold's side, and the narrative painted me as an immature young man whose wise parents were trying to save him from his own poor judgment. Jessica tried to stay optimistic. "We haven't presented our case yet," she reminded me over coffee the next morning. Once the judge hears your side of the story, this will look completely different. But I could see the worry in her eyes. Harold's team had resources experience and a compelling narrative about protecting family wealth from an irresponsible heir. We had righteous indignation and limited trial experience. As we prepared for the next phase of the proceedings, I couldn't shake the feeling that the outcome had already been decided before we'd ever set foot in that courtroom. The second hearing began with Harold presenting what he called additional evidence of Mr. Morrison's concerning financial behavior. I had no idea what he was talking about until he started distributing professional-looking documents to Judge Harrison and the court clerk. Your Honor, these documents came to light after our initial hearing, Harold said with the satisfaction of a prosecutor revealing a smoking gun. They demonstrate that Mr. Morrison has been in contact with high-risk investment schemes that could potentially drain his entire inheritance within months. My stomach dropped as I watched Judge Harrison examine the papers. From where I sat, I could see official-looking letterheads and what appeared to be my signature on several pages. Jessica leaned over to whisper urgently in my ear. "What are these documents? Have you been in contact with any investment companies?" "No," I whispered back. "I have no idea what these are." But Harold was already calling his first witness, Marcus Webb, the financial consultant from the previous hearing. Webb approached the witness stand carrying a thick folder and wearing the grave expression of someone about to deliver bad news. "Mr. Webb," Harold began, "you've had an opportunity to review the investment documents that were recently discovered. Can you explain to the court what they represent?" Tichit. Webb opened his folder and pulled out the papers I'd seen Harold distributing. These appear to be preliminary agreements and correspondence related to cryptocurrency investment schemes and high-yield opportunity funds. The companies involved, Apex Digital Ventures and Maximum Return Solutions, are not registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission and have been flagged by several state financial regulators as potentially fraudulent operations. And Mr. Morrison's apparent involvement with these companies. According to these documents, Mr. Morrison has been in preliminary discussions about investing significant portions of his inheritance, potentially up to $200,000, in these unregulated schemes. The projected returns promised by these companies, ranging from 30 to 50% annually, are classic indicators of fraudulent investment scams. I felt like the courtroom was spinning around me. Jessica was frantically scribbling notes and looking between me and the documents with increasing confusion. Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Mr. Webb, in your professional opinion, what would be the likely outcome if Mr. Morrison proceeded with these investments?" "Total loss of principal within 6 to 12 months, Your Honor. These companies typically disappear once they've collected enough investor funds. If Mr. Morrison had proceeded with these investments, his grandfather's entire legacy could have been wiped out." Harold called his next witness Dr. Angela Winters, whom he identified as Sean's former academic advisor from art school. I remembered Dr. Winters as a tough but fair professor who'd been disappointed when I left the program, but I had no idea why she was testifying. "Dr. Winters, you supervised Mr. Morrison during his time in your art program. Can you describe his academic performance and decision-making during that period?" Dr. Winters looked uncomfortable, but answered honestly. "Sean was a talented student with good creative instincts, but he struggled with time management and following through on long-term projects. When he left the program, he was failing 2 courses and had stopped attending classes regularly." "Did he discuss his reasons for leaving?" "He said he was overwhelmed and couldn't handle the pressure. I tried to work with him on developing better study habits and stress management techniques, but he seemed to have already made up his mind to quit." "In your professional opinion, did Mr. Morrison demonstrate the persistence and judgment necessary for managing complex long-term commitments?" "The man to reach Anshimoishim Harihans." Dr. Winters hesitated. "Academic performance isn't necessarily predictive of financial judgment. However, Sean did show a pattern of avoiding difficult situations rather than working through them systematically." Harold's next witnesses were my Uncle Carl and Aunt Diane, who testified about family gatherings, where I'd allegedly made concerning comments about money and spending. At our daughter's birthday party last month, Aunt Diane testified, Sean was talking about how weird it felt to have money for the first time. He made several jokes about living it up and finally being able to afford the good stuff. It seemed like he was treating the inheritance as play money, rather than understanding the responsibility that came with it. Uncle Carl's testimony was even more damaging. Sean seemed different at family gatherings, more secretive, less interested in talking about his plans. When we asked about his future, his answers were vague. He talked about exploring options and seeing what opportunities came up, but he didn't seem to have any concrete goals. The most devastating moment came when Harold presented security footage from my bank. The grainy video showed me making a large cash withdrawal, which Harold described as suspicious financial activity inconsistent with normal banking patterns for someone with legitimate financial planning goals. Your Honor, this footage shows Mr. Morrison withdrawing $8,000 in cash on a single day. When asked about this withdrawal during his deposition, he claimed it was for apartment-related expenses, but he could not provide receipts or documentation for how this cash was used. The withdrawal had actually been for my apartment security deposit, first month's rent, and moving expenses, all of which I'd paid in cash as required by my landlord. But without receipts for every expenditure, my explanation sounded weak and evasive. Dr. Morse returned to the witness stand to present her updated psychological evaluation. This time, she had pages of notes and formal diagnostic language that made my normal behavior sound pathological. After reviewing additional evidence about Mr. Morrison's financial activities and family interactions, I'm concerned about emerging patterns consistent with impulse control disorder and financial decision-making impairment. His apparent involvement with fraudulent investment schemes, combined with his social withdrawal from family support systems, suggests deteriorating judgment that could pose significant risk to his financial well-being. In your professional opinion, does Mr. Morrison currently possess the capacity to manage a substantial inheritance responsibly? Based on the totality of evidence, I have serious concerns about his current capacity for making sound financial decisions without appropriate oversight and guidance. When Jessica tried to cross-examine Dr. Morse about the basis for her diagnosis, she was shut down by technical objections from Harold's team. Your Honor, Harold interjected, defense counsel is not qualified to challenge clinical psychological assessments. Dr. Morse's professional opinion speaks for itself. Judge Harrison sustained the objection, leaving Jessica unable to challenge the core of Dr. Morse's testimony. The hearing concluded with Harold requesting immediate full conservatorship, arguing that the newly discovered evidence demonstrated urgent risk to my inheritance. Your Honor, we now know that Mr. Morrison has been actively pursuing investments that would completely destroy his grandfather's legacy. This is not a matter of differing opinions about financial planning. This is about protecting a vulnerable young man from financial predators who are clearly targeting him because of his inexperience and substantial assets. Jessica's closing argument felt desperate and ineffective compared to Harold's methodical presentation. Your Honor, my client maintains that he has never been in contact with any investment companies and has no knowledge of these alleged documents. The evidence presented today raises serious questions about authenticity and chain of custody that deserve thorough investigation before any permanent decisions are made about Mr. Morrison's legal capacity. But Judge Harrison seemed convinced by the weight of evidence Harold had presented. Ms. Branch, while chain of custody questions may be relevant for criminal proceedings, this court must prioritize protecting Mr. Morrison's assets while these questions are resolved. The potential for irreversible financial harm outweighs procedural concerns about document authentication. As we left the courthouse, Jessica was already on her phone trying to reach experts who could examine the investment documents for signs of forgery. But I could see in her face that she knew we were losing this case badly. That evening, the news coverage was even worse than before. The story now focused on my involvement with fraudulent investment schemes and included interviews with financial experts explaining how young people who inherit sudden wealth are targeted by scammers. Sitting in my apartment surrounded by moving boxes I still hadn't fully unpacked, I tried to understand how my life had spiraled so completely out of control. 3 months ago, I'd been a normal young man with a retail job and modest ambitions. Now I was being portrayed in local media as a financially incompetent fraud victim, whose own parents had to seek court protection to save him from himself. But the worst part was the growing doubt in my own mind. Everyone around me seemed convinced I was making poor decisions. Professional evaluators, financial experts, family members, even a judge were all telling me I lacked the judgment to manage my own affairs. Maybe they were right. Maybe I really was too immature and inexperienced to handle an inheritance this substantial. For the first time since this nightmare began, I started wondering if I should just give up and let my parents take control. At least then the humiliation would stop. At least then I could go back to being a normal person instead of a cautionary tale about inherited wealth and poor judgment. Jessica called that evening with news that made everything worse. Sean, I need to tell you something about those investment documents. I had a preliminary analysis done, and there are some serious problems with challenging their authenticity. The paper, ink, and formatting all appear legitimate. If these are forgeries, they're extremely sophisticated ones that would require significant resources and expertise to create. But I've never heard of these companies. I've never contacted any investment firms. I believe you, but proving that in court is going to be much harder than I anticipated. Harold's team has done their homework on this. As I hung up the phone, one thought kept echoing in my mind. If these documents were sophisticated forgeries who had the resources and motivation to create them, and why did everyone seem so convinced of their authenticity except me? The answer to that question would change everything, but I had no idea how to find it. I was sitting in my car outside the courthouse after another disastrous hearing when someone tapped on my passenger window. A man in his 50s with weathered features and kind eyes was standing beside my car holding a business card. Sean Morrison, I'm Tommy Martinez, private investigator. Mind if I talk to you for a minute? I was so exhausted from legal battles that talking to a stranger seemed like the most normal thing that had happened to me in weeks. Tommy slid into the passenger seat and handed me his card. I know this might sound strange, but I've been watching your case and some things aren't adding up. You're investigating me too. Tommy smiled. Actually, I was hired by your great-aunt Helen to look into your grandfather's estate distribution. She was concerned about some irregularities in the probate process. But the more I dug, the more interested I became in what's happening to you. Aunt Helen was my grandfather's younger sister, a sharp woman in her 80s who lived in Florida and rarely visited, but always remembered birthdays and holidays. I hadn't spoken to her since the funeral. What kind of irregularities? Tommy pulled out a manila folder. Let me ask you something first. How much do you know about your parents' financial situation? I assumed they were doing okay. Dad's an insurance adjuster, Mom works part-time at a dental office. They own their house, have decent cars. Why? Because they're in serious financial trouble, Sean. I'm talking bankruptcy-level debt that they've been hiding for at least 2 years. Tommy spread out documents on my dashboard. Bank statements, credit card bills, loan applications, and foreclosure notices I'd never seen before. Your father co-signed on a real estate investment deal that went bad. He and your mother invested their retirement savings and took out a second mortgage on their house to buy rental properties in a development that never got finished. They owe $430,000 on properties that are worth maybe $100,000 in their current state. I stared at the papers in shock. How is this possible? They never mentioned any investments because they were ashamed and desperate. Look at these credit card statements. They've been living on borrowed money for 18 months, making minimum payments and taking cash advances to cover basic expenses. Their mortgage is 3 months behind. They're facing foreclosure in the next 60 days, unless they come up with significant money fast. But what does this have to do with my conservatorship case? Tommy pointed to another document. Look at the letterhead on this loan application. Kellerman Phillips and Associates. Your parents' attorney isn't just their lawyer. He was their partner in the real estate investment that failed. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You're saying Harold is in financial trouble too? Harold Kellerman is facing professional and financial ruin. The real estate deal he sold to your parents and a dozen other families was based on fraudulent environmental assessments and construction permits. When the state shut down the development, everyone who invested lost their money. Harold's law firm is being sued by multiple clients, and the State Bar Association is investigating him for professional misconduct. Tommy handed me another set of papers. Here's where it gets interesting. Dr. Patricia Morse, the psychologist who evaluated you. She owes Kellerman's firm $68,000 in legal fees from her own financial disputes. She's been his client for 2 years, so she has a conflict of interest. More than that, she has a financial incentive to support whatever Kellerman wants. If she doesn't cooperate with his strategy, he could demand immediate payment of her outstanding legal bills. I sat back in my car seat trying to process everything Tommy had uncovered. You're telling me this entire conservatorship case is because my parents and their lawyer need my inheritance money to solve their own financial problems? That's exactly what I'm telling you, and I think I can prove it. Tommy pulled out a final folder. Remember those investment documents that supposedly show you were planning to invest in fraudulent schemes? I had a forensic computer analyst examine the metadata. Those documents were created on computers in Kellerman's office using his law firm's document templates. They're forgeries. Sophisticated ones, but yes, the dates and signatures are fake. The companies listed are real businesses that exist only as shell corporations registered to addresses that trace back to Kellerman's associates. This whole thing is an elaborate fraud designed to make you look financially incompetent while positioning your parents as responsible guardians. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. Can we prove this in court? We can try, but it's going to be tricky. Kellerman has done this before, with at least 2 other families. He targets people who inherit substantial assets, then manufactures evidence of incapacity to justify conservatorships that give his clients access to the money. It's a sophisticated long-term scam. Tommy started gathering the documents. Here's what we need to do. Your attorney, Jessica, she's good, but she's inexperienced with this kind of fraud. I'm going to connect her with someone who specializes in conservatorship abuse cases. Meanwhile, I need you to help me gather more evidence about your parents' financial situation and Kellerman's business relationships. What kind of evidence? Phone records, email communications, bank transfers between your parents and Kellerman. Anything that shows coordination between the conservatorship case and their financial problems. As Tommy prepared to leave, he paused at the car door. Sean, I want you to know something. Your great Aunt Helen hired me because she remembered how proud your grandfather was of you. He used to brag about how you were finding your own way in life, how you had integrity, even when things were difficult. She thought something was wrong when she heard about this conservatorship case, and she was right. That evening, I called Jessica to tell her about Tommy's discoveries. Her reaction was immediate and intense. If what he's found is accurate, this case just became a criminal matter. We're not just defending against conservatorship anymore. We're dealing with fraud conspiracy and professional misconduct by officers of the court. What does that mean for me? It means we fight back, hard. But Sean, you need to understand that this is going to get much worse before it gets better. When we expose what Kellerman and your parents have been doing, there will be serious legal consequences for all of them, including my parents. Jessica's voice was gentle but firm. Your parents conspired to have you declared legally incompetent based on fabricated evidence. That's fraud. And in this case, it's fraud. that could have cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars and your legal autonomy. Yes, there will be consequences. That night, I lay awake thinking about everything Tommy had revealed. My parents weren't just misguided or overprotective. They were desperate people who'd made terrible financial decisions, and they were willing to destroy my independence to solve their own problems. But understanding their motivation didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. If anything, it made it worse. They'd looked me in the eye and lied for months about their concerns for my well-being while secretly plotting to steal my inheritance and have me declared legally incompetent. The next morning, I met Tommy at a coffee shop downtown to plan our investigation. He handed me a list of tasks that would help build our case. First, we need to document your actual financial behavior over the past few months. Bank statements, receipts, any evidence that contradicts their claims about reckless spending. Second, I need you to try to remember any conversations with your parents about their finances, investments, or money problems. Third, if you have access to their house, I need you to look for any documents related to their real estate investments or communications with Kellerman. You want me to search their house? Only if you can do it safely and legally. But Sean, we need evidence of the conspiracy between your parents and Kellerman. Right now, we have circumstantial evidence of financial motivation, but we need proof of actual coordination. As I drove home from that meeting, I realized that my fight for financial independence had become something much larger. This wasn't just about my inheritance anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of legal abuse that had already victimized other families and would continue if we didn't stop it. But first, I had to find a way to prove that the people who claimed to love me most in the world had been lying to everyone, including themselves, about their real reasons for trying to control my life. Armed with Tommy's evidence and a new legal strategy, Jessica requested an emergency hearing to present what she called newly discovered material information that directly impacts the court's previous rulings. Judge Harrison seemed annoyed by the request, but he couldn't deny us the opportunity to present evidence of potential fraud. Harold fought hard to have our evidence excluded from the record. Your Honor, he argued during a pre-hearing conference, defense counsel is attempting to introduce irrelevant financial information about the petitioners in order to distract from the core issues of this case. Mr. Morrison's capacity to manage his inheritance should be evaluated on his own merits, not on speculation about his parents' financial situation. But Jessica had done her homework. Your Honor, we're not introducing speculation. We have documented evidence of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy that directly undermines the credibility of every piece of evidence the petitioners have presented to this court. When Tommy took the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed immediately. Unlike the previous witnesses who testified about subjective observations and professional opinions, Tommy presented hard facts supported by documents, digital evidence, and financial records. I've been a licensed private investigator for 23 years, he began. I specialize in financial fraud and asset protection cases. In the course of investigating irregularities in William Morrison's estate, I discovered evidence of systematic fraud in this conservatorship case. Tommy's testimony methodically dismantled the foundation of my parents' petition. He showed the court bank records proving my parents were facing bankruptcy. He presented loan documents connecting Harold Kellerman to their failed real estate investments. He revealed Dr. Morse's outstanding legal bills to Kellerman's firm. But the most dramatic moment came when Tommy presented the forensic analysis of the investment documents. These documents were created using computers and software in Mr. Kellerman's law office. Tommy testified. The metadata shows creation dates that post-date the alleged communications with Mr. Morrison. The company letterheads were copied from legitimate businesses, but the contact information has been altered to route communications through intermediaries connected to Mr. Kellerman's associates. Jessica displayed enlarged copies of the forensic evidence on a screen for the court. Your Honor, these documents that were presented as evidence of Mr. Morrison's poor financial judgment are sophisticated forgeries created for the purpose of supporting this conservatorship petition. Harold objected furiously. Your Honor, this technical evidence is highly speculative and based on analysis techniques that have not been validated by this court. But Judge Harrison was leaning forward in his chair, studying the forensic analysis with intense interest. Mr. Kellerman, are you claiming that this metadata analysis is inaccurate? I'm claiming it's irrelevant to the core question of Mr. Morrison's capacity, Your Honor. The court finds it highly relevant if evidence presented to this court was fabricated. Tommy continued his testimony by revealing the scope of what he'd discovered. This is not an isolated incident, Your Honor. I've identified at least 3 other families in this jurisdiction who have been targeted by similar conservatorship schemes involving Mr. Kellerman and his associates. In each case, individuals who inherited substantial assets were subjected to fraudulent evaluations and manufactured evidence of incapacity. Jessica called her next witness, Dr. Robert Chen, an independent psychologist who'd reviewed Dr. Morse's evaluation methods and conclusions. Dr. Morse's assessment violates multiple professional standards for psychological evaluation, Dr. Chen testified. She reached clinical conclusions based on insufficient data, failed to disclose her financial relationship with petitioner's counsel, and presented normal behavioral variations as evidence of pathology. In my professional opinion, her evaluation is fundamentally flawed and ethically compromised. The most emotional moment came when Jessica called Mrs. Coleman, the neighbor, who testified about my allegedly suspicious behavior. Mrs. Coleman, did anyone help you prepare your testimony for this court? Yes, Mr. Kellerman came to my house several times to go over what I would say. Did he suggest specific language or interpretations for what you'd observed? Ititachichen. Mrs. Coleman looked uncomfortable. He explained how normal activities might actually be signs of problems I hadn't recognized. He said young people with sudden wealth often engage in risky behaviors that look innocent to neighbors. Did you actually witness any illegal or truly concerning activities? No, she admitted quietly. Sean has always been a polite young man. Mr. Kellerman just helped me understand that some of his behaviors might be warning signs. Harold's attempt to cross-examine Tommy was a disaster. Every question he asked opened the door for Tommy to present additional evidence of the conspiracy. Mr. Martinez, isn't it true that you were hired by a family member who disagrees with this conservatorship? I was hired to investigate irregularities in estate distribution. The conservatorship fraud was discovered during that investigation. And you have financial motivations for discrediting my clients. I'm being paid a flat fee for investigative services. I have no financial interest in the outcome of this case. However, Mr. Kellerman, you have $430,000 worth of financial interest in gaining access to Mr. Morrison's inheritance to cover your failed investment losses. Judge Harrison called for a 30-minute recess, during which Harold, Dr. Morse, and my parents huddled in urgent conversation outside the courtroom. When we reconvened, Harold made a motion that shocked everyone. Your Honor, in light of the testimony presented today, my clients are withdrawing their petition for conservatorship and requesting that all previous court orders be vacated. But Jessica wasn't done. Your Honor, given the evidence of fraud and conspiracy that's been presented, we request that this matter be referred to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. Judge Harrison looked like a man who'd discovered he'd been made a fool of in his own courtroom. Mr. Kellerman, do you have any response to the allegations of document forgery and conspiracy that have been presented today? Harold's face had gone pale. Your Honor, my clients acted in good faith based on their genuine concerns about their son's welfare. Any irregularities in documentation were the result of clerical errors and miscommunication, not intentional fraud. Clerical errors that resulted in sophisticated forgeries with fabricated company information and false metadata. Your Honor, I would need time to investigate these technical claims before responding substantively. Judge Harrison was clearly struggling with how to handle the situation. A respected attorney had apparently orchestrated an elaborate fraud in his courtroom, using fabricated evidence to seek legal control over an innocent person's life and assets. This hearing is continued pending investigation by appropriate authorities. All conservatorship orders are immediately vacated. Mr. Morrison's access to his accounts is fully restored. Mr. Kellerman, you are advised to retain separate legal counsel immediately. As we left the courtroom, I saw my parents sitting alone in the hallway. Dad had his head in his hands, and Mom was crying silently. For a moment, I felt something that surprised me: pity. They'd been desperate and scared, facing financial ruin and the loss of everything they'd worked for. But that didn't excuse what they'd tried to do to me. Dad looked up as I passed. "Sean, we never meant for it to go this far. We just wanted to protect you." I stopped walking. Protect me from what? Making my own decisions. Living my own life. Mom reached out toward me. "Honey, we were terrified you were going to make the same mistakes we did. Lose everything. Like we lost everything. So you decided to steal my inheritance and have me declared mentally incompetent instead." Dad stood up slowly. "We thought if we could just manage things for a while, until you had more experience, we could protect you from the kind of financial disasters that destroyed our lives. By destroying mine instead, there was no answer to that question because there was no good answer. They'd chosen their financial problems over my autonomy, their desperation over my trust, their fear over my future." That evening, Jessica called with news that would cap off the most extraordinary day of my life. "Sean, I just got a call from the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. Harold Kellerman's conservatorship scheme is under federal investigation. They want to interview you about your experience, and they think your case might be the key to bringing down a larger operation." 2 months later, Harold Kellerman was arrested on federal charges of fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of legal process. Dr. Morse lost her license to practice psychology. My parents avoided criminal charges, but were ordered to pay full restitution for legal costs and damages. But the real victory wasn't legal or financial. It was the realization that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined capable of fighting for myself, even when everyone around me insisted I was incapable of making good decisions. 6 months after the FBI arrested Harold Kellerman in open court, I was sitting in my new art studio apartment, putting the finishing touches on a painting I'd started the day after my conservatorship was dismissed. The canvas showed a young man standing at the edge of a cliff looking out over a vast landscape he'd never seen before. It wasn't subtle symbolism, but it captured exactly how I felt about my life now. The federal investigation had moved faster than anyone expected. Harold's conservatorship scheme had affected 14 families across 3 states, bilking victims out of over $2 million in stolen inheritance and asset management fees. When FBI agents raided his office, they found detailed files on potential targets, including psychological profiles and financial assessments designed to identify vulnerable people who'd recently inherited money. Dr. Patricia Morse had lost more than her license. The state medical board's investigation revealed she'd been providing fraudulent psychological evaluations for Harold's schemes for over 3 years, collecting fees for rubber stamp assessments that declared mentally healthy people incompetent. Her practice was closed permanently, and she faced civil lawsuits from multiple victims. The most satisfying moment came during Harold's sentencing hearing when Judge Harrison, the same judge who'd nearly granted my parents' conservatorship petition, delivered a statement that acknowledged the court system's failure. "Mr. Kellerman, you exploited the legal system designed to protect vulnerable individuals and turned it into a weapon for financial predation. You corrupted the sacred trust between families, perverted the role of legal advocacy, and manipulated this court into becoming an unwitting accomplice to theft and fraud. The damage you've caused extends far beyond financial harm to the very foundations of family relationships and legal institutions." Harold received 12 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay restitution to all his victims. But more importantly, His conviction led to systematic reforms in how conservatorship cases are handled, including mandatory independent oversight and conflict of interest screening for all professionals involved. My relationship with my parents had evolved into something I never could have imagined 6 months earlier. They'd avoided criminal charges largely because I chose not to pursue maximum prosecution, but they still faced the consequences of their choices. The house they'd lived in for 20 years was sold to pay their debts. They'd moved into a small apartment across town and were both working extra jobs to cover basic expenses. But something unexpected had happened during their financial collapse. Without the pressure of maintaining appearances and hiding their desperation, they'd started being honest with me for the first time in years. Dad had enrolled in financial counseling and admitted he'd made investment decisions based on pride and fear rather than prudence. Mom had started therapy to address what she called her catastrophic thinking about money and security. "We were drowning," Dad told me, during one of our awkward but increasingly honest monthly dinners. When Harold approached us about the conservatorship option, it felt like a life preserver. "We convinced ourselves we were protecting you because we couldn't face the fact that we were really trying to save ourselves." "But you had to know it was wrong," I said. "Lying to the court, fabricating evidence, trying to have me declared incompetent. You had to know that was wrong." Mom's eyes filled with tears, something that had happened during every one of these conversations. "We did know it was wrong, but we were so scared of losing everything that we told ourselves the ends would justify the means. We thought if we could just get through the crisis, we'd find a way to make it right later. Later, when after you'd spent my inheritance solving your problems," Dad nodded slowly. "That was the plan, as much as we had one. Use part of your inheritance to stabilize our finances, then gradually transfer control back to you as you gained more experience. We told ourselves we were being responsible guardians, not thieves. These conversations were painful for all of us, but they were also necessary. I was learning that my parents weren't evil people, just scared ones who'd made terrible choices when their backs were against the wall. That didn't excuse what they'd done, but it helped me understand how people could rationalize betraying someone they loved." Tommy Martinez had become more than an investigator in my case. He'd started a nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing conservatorship abuse and helping other families who'd been victimized by similar schemes. He'd asked me to serve on the board of directors using my experience to help develop educational materials and support services. "Most people don't understand how sophisticated these schemes can be," Tommy explained during one of our board meetings. "They target families during vulnerable times when people are dealing with grief inheritance or financial stress. They exploit the legal system's good intentions and turn protection into predation." My involvement with Tommy's organization had connected me with other conservatorship abuse survivors, and their stories had given me perspective on my own experience. Sarah Martinez, a woman in her 50s, had been declared incompetent by her own children after she inherited her parents' farm. James Cooper, a military veteran, had lost control of his disability settlement to a court-appointed guardian who systematically drained his accounts. "The thing people don't realize," Sarah told me, "is that conservatorship doesn't just steal your money. It steals your identity as an adult human being. Suddenly you need permission to make decisions about your own life. You're treated like a child by people who are supposed to be helping you." Working with these survivors had taught me that my legal victory was just the beginning. The real work was preventing other families from going through the same nightmare and rebuilding trust in legal systems that were supposed to protect people, not exploit them. Jessica Branch had used her success in my case to specialize in conservatorship defense and family rights law. She'd started getting referrals from across the state and had hired 2 additional attorneys to help handle the growing caseload. "Your case changed everything for me professionally," she told me over coffee one afternoon. "Before this, I thought family law was mostly about divorce and custody disputes. I had no idea there were people systematically gaming the conservatorship system to steal from vulnerable families. What's the most important thing you learned that you have to dig deeper than the surface narrative? In your case, everyone was telling this story about a concerned family protecting an irresponsible young man. But the real story was about desperate people exploiting legal loopholes and institutional blind spots. Now I question every conservatorship case that comes through my office. Perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the entire ordeal was my return to art school. The inheritance that had nearly been stolen from me was now funding my education at a respected design program, where I was studying art therapy, with a focus on helping people process trauma and family conflicts. My professors were initially puzzled by my choice to focus on family dynamics and legal trauma in my artistic work until I explained my own experience. Now my paintings and installation pieces were being featured in exhibitions about justice, family relationships, and institutional reform. The painting I'd been working on that morning, the one of a young man at the cliff's edge, was part of a series I'd titled Legal Limbo. Each piece explored different aspects of what it felt like to have your autonomy questioned and your capacity doubted by institutions supposedly designed to protect you. My favorite piece in the series showed a courtroom where all the furniture was made of mirrors, reflecting distorted images of the people who occupied them. The judge's bench reflected a carnival funhouse mirror image, the jury box showed multiple fragmented reflections, and the witness stand displayed whoever sat in it as a child in adult clothing. It's about how the legal system can distort your sense of yourself, I explained to visitors during the exhibition opening. When professionals and family members stand up in court and describe you as incompetent or incapable, you start questioning your own judgment. You begin to see yourself through their distorted perspective instead of trusting your own experience. The exhibition had generated interest from legal reform organizations and family advocacy groups. Several law schools had requested permission to use my artwork in courses about conservatorship abuse and professional ethics. But the most meaningful response had come from my great-aunt Helen, who'd flown up from Florida for the exhibition opening. "Your grandfather would have been so proud," she told me as we stood in front of the cliff painting. "He always said you had the strongest moral compass of anyone in the family. He worried that the world might try to break that compass, but he believed you'd find ways to keep it pointing true north." "I'm not sure my moral compass is that reliable," I admitted. 6 months ago, I was seriously considering giving in to the conservatorship just to make the nightmare stop. Aunt Helen smiled. "That's not a broken moral compass, honey. That's a human being dealing with an impossible situation. Your grandfather went through his own dark period during the Depression, when he lost his first business and had to start over. He used to say that moral strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up and helping other people avoid the same holes you fell into." As the evening wound down and visitors began leaving the gallery, I found myself standing alone with the cliff painting. The young man in the image was still poised at the edge of that precipice, but now I realized he wasn't looking down into an abyss. He was looking out toward a horizon full of possibilities he'd never imagined. The inheritance that had nearly destroyed my family relationships and legal autonomy had become the foundation for a new kind of independence. Not just financial independence, but the independence that comes from knowing you can stand up for yourself when everyone around you insists you're incapable of good judgment. I thought about calling my parents to tell them about the exhibition, then decided to wait until our next monthly dinner. We were still rebuilding trust slowly, and I wanted to share this milestone in person rather than over the phone. They were trying to understand the person I was becoming, just as I was trying to understand the people they'd always been underneath their fear and desperation. Tommy had been right when he told me that exposing Harold's scheme would help other families avoid similar victimization. But he'd underestimated something important. Fighting for my own autonomy had taught me that independence isn't just about having the legal right to make your own decisions. It's about having the courage to trust your own judgment, even when everyone around you suggests you're wrong. That courage, more than any amount of money, was the real inheritance my grandfather had left me. Not the $300,000 in investment accounts, but the faith that I could figure out how to use that money wisely if I trusted myself and learned from my mistakes. Standing in that gallery surrounded by artwork born from trauma and transformation, I realized that the scariest moment of my life had also been the most important, because it had forced me to discover strength I didn't know I had and values I'd never had to defend before. The young man at the cliff's edge wasn't falling into an abyss. He was learning to fly. I want to ask you something that's been on my mind since sharing this story. Have you ever been in a situation where people who claim to love you tried to control your choices because they thought they knew what was best for you? How did you find the courage to trust your own judgment when everyone around you suggested you were wrong? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories about standing up for yourself when the stakes are highest. Share this with someone who might need to hear that their judgment matters. And remember that your independence is worth fighting for, even when the people questioning it are the ones you love most. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that you're stronger and wiser than anyone else has the right to decide.